Give me 1 second here. All right. All right. Thank you. Thanks for bearing with me. Thanks for anyone who had any technical challenges. Hi, I'm Brian Gresco. Welcome to the Antibody, a quarantine reading series, part of LitHub's virtual book channel. It's been another week in America. I hope you're doing okay. I hope you're keeping healthy and taking care of yourself. I'm grateful to be here with you guys this evening, back in my big red chair with you tonight from my writing studio in Brooklyn. Thanks to the familiar names and the faces that I'm seeing out there, and welcome to anyone who's here for the first time. I'm grateful for your presence. And for the 3 novelists who are joining us this evening, we've got a great lineup. Makenna Goodman is here, Hari Kunzru is here, and Sigrid Nunes is here. And before we open ourselves to their words, I hope you will join me in settling yourself in comfortably with a deep breath. Physically, you are where you are, but for the next hour or so, we are in this shared intellectual space together. And while we are, I ask that you please keep your mic muted. We don't have a stage, but we do have a microphone, and we're going to honor the authors when they have it, as each author is going to read to us for a little bit. And at the end of the event, there will be time for a Q&A, so be ready for that. Because yeah, you are in the presence of 3 experts tonight. The chat, as always, is open and public, so you can show your appreciation of the authors. And I ask, please show your appreciation of the authors often and enthusiastically. I'm really excited to welcome our first reader, Makenna Goodman. Makenna is the author of the novel The Shame, which was named a Literary Hub recommended read for August 2020 and a Bustle most anticipated book. Her words and work have been featured in the Paris Review, Electric Literature, Guernica, LitHub, Catapult, The Rumpus, the Adroit Journal, and other venues. And she is joining us tonight from Vermont, from where she lives. So please get those keys clicking and get your fingers tapping as you welcome Makenna. Hi, Makenna. The mic is yours.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm totally honored to be here with these incredible novelists. A true honor. I guess I will start by saying just a quick summary of what The Shame is about to give context for my brief reading. It takes place over the course of one day where a woman is driving through the night away from her family. She lives in Vermont, and she has 2 young children and an academic husband. And basically, as she drives towards her destination, you discover through recollections what has brought her to this moment. In a sense, she feels trapped by the choices of her life. She desires community. She's finding it through the books by women writers that she's reading. And in order to commune with them, she feels an urgent desire to write a novel, to be in conversation, that's the only way that she can truly feel in community. And she gets distracted by various things, including a fixation with a woman she discovers online that she's using for character development. So I'm going to read a section of one of her reflections as she's driving in the car. Our nighttime routine took about an hour and a half. Usually I slept with my children, one or both, depending on the rest of the night's migratory patterns, with a set of hands rubbing my torso for comfort and a set of feet rubbing my legs, as if I were a post for 2 cats in perpetual itch or ecstasy. It was hard to know which. If I managed to stay awake, I had about 2 hours of alone time in the dark where I felt like anything was possible. All I was thinking about was stories. Other women's, my own. My mind was blooming, and so I began writing again, really for the first time. Lying next to my children at night as they fell asleep, I started to plot things out in my mind. How I could make a narrator braver than I was. How I would give her the words that I could never say aloud. How I could mutate dialogue overheard in the post office and put it in my narrator's husband's mouth, even though my own husband would likely never say it. Asa always fell asleep after a couple of pages of his book, and so I had the nights to myself. I wrote by hand, mostly, in a large hardcover journal with blank pages. I found myself writing about my life in a way that was much different from how I had before, more to understand it as part of a collective experience. I started mapping out a narrative that was more than just my story. It was the story of isolation, of capital. My main character was a woman like me. Her husband was a man like Asa. She had 2 kids and some ambivalences about her role as a mother. She was an artist. I even called her an artist at first because I wanted her to identify as something I had never felt able to. I wrote without stopping and without judgment, and honestly, it felt easy. This, I thought, is what having a creative practice feels like. If I didn't write, I felt an absence. I thought of my mother who left the house every morning to go to work, only to circle around and enter through the basement to her writing studio below. I never knew she was there, and I didn't see her until dinner time. She spent the whole day downstairs as my little feet pattered above, my life curated dutifully by a woman who was paid to love me. Now, for the first time in my life, I understood why. In writing, I found a much needed detachment from reality that didn't come from daydreaming or gardening or looking through old photos or shopping on eBay. I could say anything, be anyone. I could make up whatever I wanted, even if much of it was drawn from my real life. I could exalt an analysis of my own mundanity that felt, in other circumstances, like whining. And I could begin a sentence based in truth and end it with a falsity so obscene, I was sure my neighbors, if they ever read it, would think I was some sort of pervert. I became filled with a sensation of limitless possibility and of the potential for community. Because if I finished my story, maybe someone would read it, and maybe the world would change, or maybe I would. I fantasized about one day being closer to the literary witches I'd been pursuing in their cauldrons of sensuous discourse, about being legitimately affiliated with them, perhaps even physically. Maybe, I thought, if we shared a publisher, we would be put on a panel together. Maybe we would be invited by the same corporation to present during a week-long development seminar to offer our opinions on the state of the world and the role of fiction in shaping possible futures. I had the thought that writing could be my ticket out of the tedium of rural life, the trap of maternal domesticity and the endless support of my husband, which had taken precedence over everything else, the coexistence with the land that we had chosen, and yet that made it impossible for me to do much beyond driving back and forth from school, setting up sheep fence, mowing, moving the fence, mowing again, shaking grain in the bucket. This is not to say that I didn't entertain doubts about my work. As I read more about my female peers, a term I applied loosely and maybe hazardously, I learned that many of them had struggled against darker specters than the mundane. They had fought more demons than I could imagine. And so I began to wonder if anyone would give a shit about the things I had to say, or whether I was only illuminating experiences that mattered little, ultimately. From the outside, I knew my life looked good. My children were healthy, the food in my root cellar was procured ethically, according to my own system of beliefs, and compared to most, I was bathing in luxury, even if there were spiders in the bath. But my life had felt so hard for so long, and I was beginning to think it wasn't going to improve. My kids would just get older. They'd start driving. There would be icy roads. I'd ask them not to go to the party they wanted to go to. They'd be mad at me for worrying too much. They'd go out anyway. Maybe they'd die in their car. And if I felt like a servant now, how would I feel when my children didn't even want to be comforted by me or held in the middle of the night? They'd want hot lunch at school. They'd buy junk food at gas stations. I was afraid of much more than my husband losing his desire for me. I was worried that even though we were living purposefully against the tides of mainstream culture, I would become abandoned by all culture and would disappear entirely. I was worried that I had made children who were self-reliant, and in so doing had made myself disposable. I was worried about losing everything. I thought about probability. The way I figured, 2 kids meant twice the chance that one of them would die young. And while every year that passed was one more year of no kids dying, the odds increased that the next year would be an off year, a year of terrible loss. These innermost fears formed the foundation of my writing, whether I knew it or not. The story as it took shape was fairly simple. It was about a couple living on an idyllic homestead during a time of war. They had inherited money and planned to use it with intention, to save the land they lived on, to reverse the tragedy of climate change in whatever way they could. They hosted important people from far distances, and each party had a fun political theme, like billionaire bingo, and the wine was from Europe. I'm sure in more ways than I consciously knew, the plot I had chosen was my way of coming to terms with the choices I'd made under fascistic governance and the epidemic of complicity that I did little to nothing about, aside from rejecting the most convenient aspects of consumerism. In my story, while the main character believed in the concept of community, she spent most of her energy celebrating herself for being virtuous. In truth, she was a machine, powered by the community itself, fueled by their desire for what she had, peddling false dreams that simply working on the land or with your hands was enough to make your way in the world. I wanted her to claim she was struggling, but to have it be obvious there was no end to her resources, or at least that the end was nowhere in sight. My plan, as I had it plotted, was to reveal her true character, to expose her. Maybe it was to expose what I feared most about myself. I wrote a scene where she hit someone with her car and drove off without helping. I wanted her to be looked down on, but also to inspire wonder and desire against the reader's better judgment. I wanted the reader to be annoyed by her entitlement, but to empathize with her too, in the way I hoped to be read if I were written down. The more I wrote about my artist, the more I realized I needed to create a completely new woman to play her, because I was so tired of myself and my own hypocrisy. I imagined who I wanted to be so I could play her. I imagined a younger, improved version of my mother, who was taller and better dressed. I called her Celeste.
Thank you so much, Makenna. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Oh my gosh, it's very cool to hear. I know, just an excerpt that shows the different layers to your novel. Thank you. Very cool. Yay! Thank you, Harmony. Yeah. Yeah. Show some love for Makenna in the chat if you appreciate that. That was really amazing. The Antibody has an affiliate shop through bookshop.org. Sadly, we can't be able to give you the physical copy of the book right now, but Bookshop will direct your sale to the nearest independent bookstore, or if one isn't nearby, they will funnel part of that sale to an independent bookstore. And if there's any money raised through that affiliate shop from me, that's going to be donated to Black Lives Matter, which I will announce that figure on Twitter. So please support our authors, support independent bookstores, and putting a link up now, you can find the Makenna's book as well as Sigrid and Hari's there to purchase. So please support our authors. Thank you again, Makenna. That was amazing. Moving along, our next reader is Sigrid Nunes. Sigrid is the author of the novels Salvation City, The Last of Her Kind, A Feather on the Breath of God, For Rowena, and the National Book Award-winning The Friend, among others. She is also the author of Sempre Susan, a memoir of Susan Sontag. She has been the recipient of several awards, including a Whiting Award, the Rome Prize in Literature, and a Berlin Prize Fellowship. And she's joining us tonight from New York City, and we'll be reading from her new book, What Are You Going Through, excuse me. Please get your keys clicking and your fingers tapping to welcome Sigrid Nunes. Sigrid, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Yes, I am reading from my most recent novel, which has just come out, What Are You Going Through? And for the part that I'm going to read, I really don't need to explain anything, I don't think. I think it will be clear. The journal I had planned to keep, a record of my friend's last days, that never happened. I started it, but almost immediately I stopped. I did not even save the few pages I had written. I discovered that I didn't want to make a written record after all. The reason seemed to be that I had no faith in it. From the beginning, it felt like a betrayal. I don't mean of my friend's privacy, but of the experience itself. No matter how hard I tried, the language could never be good enough. The reality of what was happening could never be precisely expressed. Even before I began, I knew that whatever I might manage to describe would turn out to be, at best, somewhere to the side of the thing, while the thing itself slipped past me, like the cat you never even see escape when you open the house door. We talk glibly about finding the right words, but about the most important things, those words we never find. We put the words down as they must be put down. one after the other, but that is not life. That is not death, one word after the other. No, that is not right at all. No matter how hard we try to put the most important things into words, it is always like toe dancing in clogs. Understood, language would end up falsifying everything, as language always does. Writers know this only too well. They know it better than anyone else, and that is why the good ones sweat and bleed over their sentences. The best ones break themselves into pieces over their sentences, because if there is any truth to be found, they believe it will be found there. Language would falsify everything. Why then create an inauthentic document to be mistaken by anyone who later read it, including even myself, for the truth? Something else, writing in the journal did not have the steadying or consoling power I'd hoped for. It did not soothe me, it frustrated me instead. It made me feel dumb and hopeless. It filled me with anxiety. What a terrible writer I had become. What if all this time we have misunderstood the story of the Tower of Babel? My ex once put the question in an essay. Behold, the people is one, and they all have one language. Said God, this will not do. As one, the people might actually succeed in building the city and the heavenward tower with which they hoped to make their name. Indeed, the all-knowing knew that with a common tongue, nothing would be impossible for them. The way to stop this abomination was to replace the one language with many, and so it was done. But what if God had in fact gone even further? What if it was not just to different tribes, but to each individual human being that a separate language was given, unique as fingerprints? And step 2, to make life among humans even more strifeful and confounding, he beclouded their perception of this, so that while we might understand that there are many peoples speaking many different languages, we are fooled into thinking that everyone in our own tribe speaks the same language we do. This would explain much of human suffering, according to my ex, who was being less playful than you might think. He really did believe that's how it was. Each of us languaging on, our meaning clear to ourselves, but to nobody else. Even people in love, I asked, smilingly, teasingly, hopefully. This was at the very beginning of our relationship. He only smiled back. But years later, at the bitter end, came the bitter answer. People in love most of all. Thank you.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much, Sigrid. That was fantastic, and almost couldn't have been. Did you guys talk beforehand? That those two excerpts spoke to one another so well.
They did. No, we didn't talk, but I was struck by that myself when Makenna read.
The cats.
Yeah.
And others anyway.
Right, the cats and just thinking about writing and language and its limits. So interesting. So wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I'm putting that link up there again. If you guys are, please check out Sigrid's latest novel, and then go through the back catalog while you're there. It's really wonderful. All right, our final reader of the evening is Hari Kunzru. Born in London, Hari is the author of the novels The Impressionist, Transmission, My Revolutions, Gods Without Men, and White Tears, as well as his short story collection Noise and the novella Memory Palace. His new novel is Red Pill. He is an honorary fellow of Wadham College, Oxford, and has received fellowships from the Coleman Center at the New York Public Library, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Academy in Berlin. And he is the host of the podcast Into the Zone, which is just out from Pushkin Industries. I just started listening to it, and it's really fascinating and wonderful. And he lives in New York City, in Brooklyn, where he joins us this evening. So please get those keys clicking and your fingers tapping, and give a warm welcome to Hari. Hari, the mic is yours.
Thanks so much. Well, yeah, it's going to be another reading about a writer, and which is quite nice. We're all kind of connecting together in these ways. And I'm going to read from the very beginning of Red Pill, which makes it very easy because you don't need any context at all. I think it's possible to track the onset of middle age exactly. It's the moment when you examine your life, and instead of a field of possibility opening out, an increase in scope, you have a sense of waking up from sleep or being washed up on shore, newly conscious of your surroundings. So this is where I am, you say to yourself. This is what I've become. It's when you first understand that your condition, physically, intellectually, socially, financially, is not absolutely mutable. That what has happened will, to a great extent, determine the rest of the story. What you've done cannot be undone, and much of what you've been putting off for later will never get done at all. In short, your time is a finite and dwindling resource. From this moment on, whatever you're doing, whatever joy or intensity or whirl of pleasure you may experience, you'll never shake the almost imperceptible sensation that you're travelling on a gentle downward slope into darkness. For me, this realization of mortality took place, conventionally enough, beside my sleeping wife at our home in our apartment in Brooklyn. As I lay awake, listening to her breathing, I knew that my strength and ingenuity had their limits. I could foresee a time when I would need to rest. How I'd got there was a source of amazement to me, the chain of events that had led me to that slightly overheated bedroom, to a woman who, had things turned out differently, I might never have met or recognized as the person I wanted to spend my life with. After 5 years of marriage, I was still in love with Ray, and she was still in love with me. All that was settled, a happy fact. Our 3-year-old daughter was asleep in the next room. Our very happiness made me uneasy. It was a perverse reaction, I knew. I was like a miser fretting about his emotional hoard. Yet the mental rats running round my bedroom, round my child's bedroom, had something real behind them. It was a time when the media was full of images of children hurt and displaced by war. I frequently found myself hunched over my laptop, my eyes welling with tears. I was distressed by what I saw, but also haunted by a more selfish question. If the world changed, would I be able to protect my family? Could I scale the fence with my little girl on my shoulders? Would I be able to keep hold of my wife's hand as the rubber boat overturned? Our life together was fragile. One day something would break, one of us would have an accident, one of us would fall sick, or else the world would slide further into war and chaos, engulfing us, as it had so many other families. In most respects, I had little to complain about. I lived in one of the great cities of the world. Save for a few minor ailments, I was physically healthy, and I was loved, which protected me from some of the more destructive consequences of a so-called midlife crisis. I had friends who, without warning, embarked on absurd sexual affairs, or in one case developed a ruinous crack habit that he kept hidden from everyone until he was arrested at 3 a.m. in Elizabeth, New Jersey, smoking behind the wheel of his parked car. I was not about to fuck the nanny or gamble away our savings, but at the same time I knew there was something profoundly but subtly wrong. Some urgent question I had to answer that concerned me in isolation and couldn't be solved by waking Ray or going on the internet or padding barefoot into the bathroom and swallowing a sleeping pill. It concerned the foundation for things, beliefs I'd spent much of my life writing and thinking about, the various claims I made for myself in the world, and, coincidentally or not, it arrived at a time when I was about to go away. One reason I was awake, worrying about money and climate change and Macedonian border guards, was that an airport transfer was booked for 5 in the morning. I never sleep well on the night before I have to travel. I'm always nervous that I'll oversleep and miss my plane. I was what they call an independent scholar. I had an adjunct gig at a university, but it was in a creative writing department, and I tried not to think about it except when it was actually happening to me. When I was sitting in a seminar room, pinned by the hollow stares of a dozen debt-ridden graduate students awaiting instruction. What I wrote was published by magazines and commercial publishers, not peer-reviewed journals. Academics found me faintly disreputable, and I suppose I was. I've never been much for disciplinary boundaries. I'm interested in what I'm interested in. 5 years before my invitation to Berlin, I had published a book about taste, in which I'd argued, not very insistently, that it was intrinsic to human identity. This was barely a thesis, more a sort of bright, shiny thing that kept the reader meandering along as I strung together some thoughts on literature, music, cinema, and politics. It wasn't the book I was supposed to be writing, an ambitious work in which I intended to make a definitive case for the revolutionary potential of the arts. The taste book sort of drifted out of me, first as a distraction from the notebooks I was filling with quotations and ideas for my definitive case for the revolutionary potential of the arts, then as a distraction from the creeping realization that I really had no definitive case to make at all, or even a provisional one. I had no clue why anyone should care about the arts, let alone be spurred by them to revolution. I cared about art, but I was essentially a waster, and throughout my life other people had never liked the things I did. The only political slogan that had ever really moved me was Ne travaillez jamais, and the attempt to live that out had run into the predictable obstacles. The trouble is, there's no outside, nowhere for the disaffected to go. Refusal is meaningful if conducted en masse, but most people seem to want to cozy up to anyone with the slightest bit of power. Nothing is more scary than being left at the front when a crowd melts away behind you. Why, after all this time, was the general reader suddenly going to find me persuasive? Why would I even want to persuade him or her? What would starting an argument achieve? If I wanted to fight, all I had to do was look at my phone. So I kept my head down and wrote my distracted essays. I'd been a freelance writer since I was 23. It is a ridiculous thing to do. It's time-consuming and poorly paid. You live on your nerves. Sure, you can lie on the couch if you want, but eventually you will starve. I was in despair because I'd wasted so much time on the Revolution book, and I'd just got together with Ray and needed money to make things happen for us. And suddenly I couldn't summon the energy for the pretensions of a system. So I just wrote about some things I liked, things that made me happy. And my exhaustion must have transmitted itself in some positive manner onto the page. I'm the first to admit that I'm usually a hectoring and difficult writer, given to obscurity and tortuous sentences, because a publisher offered me a contract and along with it a way out, a plausible excuse for shelving the impossible revolutionary art project, smothering the damn thing with a pillow. A mercy killing would otherwise have been embarrassing, since I'd been talking about the book for years, doing panel discussions and think pieces and sounding off at parties. I finished the little taste book fairly quickly, and unlike my previous work, it sold. You see, said my agent, all you had to do was stop battering people round the head. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Ari. Thank you, everyone. Can you please give some shouts out there to Hari? That was awesome, and also yes, went so wonderfully well. These themes of writers and passages through life, really fantastic. I'm going to put the link up here one more time for the bookshop. So yeah, if you could want to check that out. That's Red Pill has been, I'm partway through it now, and it's been wonderful. So yeah, we have some time to do a little Q&A, and you guys in the audience out there can use the chat to ask any questions that you have about the author's work, and we'll take them as they come in. But tonight, our first question is actually going to be coming from one of our readers. Makenna is going to kick us off. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Makenna. You got it.
Great. Well, I mean, this is a question, obviously for the other novelists. I'm not asking this to myself necessarily, but in asking it, I guess I am. So both of your books, which I adored, to me represent, among many things, a kind of articulation of what one might define as the end of what one might call a liberal fantasy. The juxtaposition of what, and I've been thinking about this a lot, about what is sort of an agreed upon reality that we're all going to be okay, and true reality, whatever that is. And I think that this idea, I think it's sort of obvious that this mainstream liberal notion that we'll all be okay is at risk. And both of your books seem to me to explore a kind of delusion or existential unknowingness. And I wonder, the question is, if a novelist can traverse this space as society's most reliable liar, what to you, I say that lovingly, what to you is the truth, or what truths are you interested in magnifying in your work? In other words, and I sort of formulated this question before we all read, but the idea of fiction versus reality and how one traverses this space as part of a larger existential question. My question.
Shall I start, Sigrid, or would you like to go?
No, yes, you, since you already did start. Yes, please do. I was waiting for you to start.
Well, I suppose I can make a case for fiction as quite a good vehicle for a certain sort of thinking right now, which is that fiction is very good at doing complexity. Fiction is, is quite flexible about sort of levels and of reality, of different kinds of telling. And it's if anything defines our present moment, it's a feeling that the complexity exceeds what we can see. That there are aspects of it that seem to be kind of taking place in the shadows, and that no one kind of register really works. And I think fiction, because it can zero in on the individual experience, and it can kind of widen out into much more kind of systemic general things, is quite a good approach. Of course it's slow. Of course it won't kind of keep up with the kind of feverish news cycle in any way, but it's not in a position to head off any of the bad things that are coming to us. But I think it is quite a good way of at least describing a kind of structure of feeling, or a way that how it feels to be alive right now. Of course there isn't an easily accessible consensus reality. One of as you pointed out, one of the things that's been a kind of feature of the last few years is that the sensible commentators who have sort of rather blandly assumed that their worldview was correct have been proven wrong again and again. The Overton window has moved and moved and moved. Actually, some of the speculations which were considered wild and disreputable in 2015 have turned out to be the most accurate about the nature of 2020. So, we are, I think, in a moment of maybe much needed crisis for a certain sort of a rather kind of complacent thinking. Where we go from here obviously depends on a lot of factors kind of rushing up on us, but maybe one of the things that could be salvaged from this is a kind of re-examination of all our terms and conditions, and that so that could be something that we actually manage to do to pull out of this crisis.
Well, that was so well put. I would say, first of all, that this distinction of reality and fiction, but fiction is a part of reality. Yes, and it seems to me that that what the writer tries to do is, the writer is in the world like other individuals and takes a look at everything and tries to understand it, and then tries to present that understanding, in some kind of story. Let's say it's your usual novel, work of fiction. But I don't know about this idea about the that it's a liberal fantasy that everything is going to be all right. I mean, there are all kinds of people of all kinds of persuasions who have that idea that everything is going to be all right, because it's, as T.S. Eliot said, humankind can't really bear too much reality. So, I mean, it is what people do. So I don't really identify it as, as strictly a liberal fantasy. But I mean, the thing is, I remember Elizabeth Hardwick used to say, only writers think, as if there were no such thing as scientists or mathematicians in the world. But I mean, what she really meant was that when you're writing, you think in a way that other people don't. I mean, it happens while you're writing. And I do think that that's why that's why when you're writing, you can come to an understanding about human experience, and then if you do your job right, you can present that, and that's always going to be valuable. But a very big difference now is that all right, so if something that you're writing about in your work, like if one of the things is the various crises we're in now, but let's just say the climate crisis, I know that my readers don't need me to tell them certain things, because I mean that what they could find and what they do find on the news cycle 24 hours a day, I mean, and they just wherever they look, all this bad news is bombarding them, but nothing is really, that isn't the kind of thing that the writer needs to bring to people anymore. I think it's just some way of trying to understand it. But I don't think there's a character in my book who complains that. I don't know if it's actually a complaint, but he says, if every poet in the world wrote a poem about climate change tomorrow, it wouldn't save one tree. And although the person he says this to doesn't respond in this way, what I would say it isn't the poet's job to save trees. So what is the poet's job? So I don't really know, but I just think that, I just keep repeating myself, but I really think that what the writer does is try to understand things, and then try to make some aspects of human experience clearer to people who will read it and who are open to understanding it. But I just think that the idea of Faulkner's idea that it's the writer's job to uplift humanity, and that writers, he was saying this when he went 1950 in his Nobel Prize speech, that people were writing in a certain way, and to him it was a wrong way to write, and they were writing it out of fear, and that fear was that they were going to be bombed to death. But it's the writer's job to be valiant, he was saying, and to overcome that fear and so on. And now we have, we still fear being bombed to death, but we have these other fears of what's going to destroy everything we care about in our own lives. And we do have that fear, and how the writer deals with that any differently from anybody else, I don't really know. But I think that this idea of writer as a knight in shining armor, which Faulkner was hinting at in this speech, is kind of ludicrous now. I just don't think solutions to the problems that we have now are going to come from novelists or poets.
Makenna, what about you? How would you answer that question?
I mean, Yeah, I guess I can answer it more as a reader perhaps than as a writer, because maybe, I don't know why, but maybe both. I guess writers are readers, whatever. But I think that for me, it's about like a book being a portal into human consciousness, and that that basically, it's funny. I've been reading a lot of philosophy lately, rereading it, and I'm finding it, like I'm currently reading Spinoza, and it's dense and it's hard to understand, and yet I know that I agree with a lot of what he said, and I know that the readers, like I know that I agree with Deleuze, who agreed with Spinoza, and I like Deleuze's take on Spinoza, and yet, even with my education, which is not, as extended as some, I mean, I, just have a college degree, nothing beyond that. I feel that like that power of that philosophy is just too far away for most people to be able to read and understand. And yet the concepts are so simple and so common to humanity that divide feels too massive for me. And so fiction, whatever that means, I'm not sure I know, but I know the writers that I love play with the idea of what the boundaries between fiction and autobiography or whatever, like details of one's life, that's always been something that writers have done. And yet it seems the honesty about it somehow is an interesting component to, I don't know about both of your lives, but this idea of drawing from one's own life as drawing from the well of human experience. That's what it is. That's what we're talking about. Anyway, so I think that if a book is done well, it can be a portal into the complexity of human consciousness. If it's done really well, it can be a portal into a collective unconscious. If it's brilliant, it can be, a portal into humanity itself and what that means in the context of other worlds. I don't know. So I also feel like pacing is really important. And this is what I love so much about both Sigrid and Hari's books is the pacing. It's turn the page, you can't stop turning. Because the writing is so beautiful, and it felt like riding a raft down a coursing river. And I just kept going and following the flow. And yet I was never submerged too long that I was unable to find these pockets of air for my own story or interpretation to live alongside. And so to me, I feel like good writing is like philosophy, but that you can read, that you can, that you can read and understand on an intuitive level that doesn't take a degree, basically.
I mean, the narrative, just to build on that, the narrative in all three of your books, I feel like is extremely compelling, and yet they're packed with so many not just striking observations, but just ideas about the world and relationships and how it works to pause and to contemplate. One thing that I thought was interesting in all three of your books too is like the attachment to the first person and the I. Just to talk, I mean, as a very, maybe basic question after that after Makenna's amazing one, which is just like, why the I? Why the first person? Why, of all the different ways to tell the story that you're telling, were you attracted to writing in the first person? And what kind of what kind of work did it take to construct that voice on the page?
Before I answer that, I wanted to say, because of what Makenna was saying, that it's true that fiction deals with with all the same questions as philosophy, right? I mean, how should a person live? What does it mean to die? Whatever these they are the same questions. So it seems to me that if, as you say, if a work of fiction is any good, it is going to be dealing with some aspects of philosophy. About the first person, several of my books are in the first person, not all of them. My first one certainly was. My very first book is a work of autofiction. This recent book isn't, even though parts of it might read like that. I just, when it's time to start another work, something has to happen. You think of something, you start somewhere, and quite naturally it can come to you that this is a first person book. I want, for me, it isn't like I think, oh, I want to write a book, I'll make it in the first person. I mean, it just seems the right thing. And I'm very comfortable with the first person. And particularly in this book, it has a very intimate tone, and part of the reason why it has that intimate tone is because it is in the first person, and you feel like the narrator is speaking directly to you. So that's my answer. Hari?
Yeah, thank you. Ari?
I mean, in the case of my book, my narrator is he's writing a book about lyric poetry. That's what he wants to do. He's off to this fellowship in Germany, this residency in Germany, to write about the lyric and about the kind of intense experience of selfhood that he believes romantic lyric poets to have had. And he really gradually admits to himself that what he's there for is not to really, he wants to just have that experience of a sort of luxurious selfhood himself. And unfortunately he doesn't find it. The more he looks, the less he finds inside himself, and it becomes a kind of increasing panic. So clearly, this is about what it means to be a first person, and so the first person was the only choice for this particular sort of subject. I mean, like Sigrid, I've written books in the third person as well, and there's a nice lapidary authority that comes with the third person, and a kind of even if you're not kind of pretending to be Balzac or something like that, you still are able to kind of sort of arrive in various people's perspectives and various people's consciousnesses. But for other kinds of story, especially this kind of story where a character is basically kind of anatomizing himself and his own reactions to the world, then that kind of limitation of the first person and the lack of knowledge of the rest of the world, the lack of the sort of barrier around him, becomes quite a kind of useful tool in some ways.
Makenna, how about you?
Well, I've only written one novel, so that there's that. I can't compare it to anything else, but I was particularly interested in the way that the psyche works in terms of storytelling, not just as a writer telling a story, but also the stories that we tend to tell ourselves, that we inherit from our families, that we create, that we consume, and then how those stories layer on top of each other to create a kind of memory. And one of the things that compelled me to write my book was about how technology and the imagery perpetuated through social media, or the internet that we consume as a story, becomes imprinted on memory, and how our real lived experience is tied up with the experience of interpreting images from other people's lives. And what that does, I think I was initially compelled to it just thinking about my young nieces and whatever, just like who are growing up with this as their milieu completely. And what how it can infiltrate the psyche in a way that I'm not sure we understand. So for me, it's more like, what are our mythologies that we've inherited that inform our thinking, and how is technology? I mean, I say technology because I hesitate to say social media, because it's this idea of advertising invading the personal space, and how surveillance, in fact, we've agreed, as I'm saying, people who click agree to the terms and conditions without understanding what it means and what the implications are, and how one's experience of just simple psyche and what it means to be human is actually become data, and that data is then mirrored back to us as something that we then consume. And so it's like this sort of self-devouring, self-Ouroboros, whatever you want to call it, that seems like a deeply pathological narcissism that it's not a liberal fantasy necessarily, or a liberal thing at all, but more, what does that make us? Like, some people would say the next thing after human is Borg. There's a whole theory about that. I don't know how I feel about that, but I also wonder, like, are we on the road to Borg? Is this the first stage, the nucleus? I don't know.
Yeah, only time will tell. Resistance is futile.
Make it that
A question for Sigrid come up from Charlotte. Thank you, Charlotte. Can you speak more on autofiction and what that term means to you?
Well, when I said that my first book was autofiction, that book was published in 1995, and nobody was calling it autofiction, although that term existed. And what I meant was that in that particular book, which is in the first person, of course, it's very clear that the first person is the author. I don't call myself Sigrid. I talk about my parents, and it is very clear that book could actually have been published as nonfiction, honestly published as nonfiction, although it would have been a pretty strange piece of nonfiction. In other books that I've written, like this one and the one before this, The Friend, although they're in the first person and there are autobiographical elements, and my narrators are women and around my age, and they're writers and they teach writing, whatever happens in those books, with few exceptions, has been completely invented. So they as I say, they've been mistaken for autofiction. They've been called autofiction. Parts of them read like autofiction, but they're not. So I mean, I know the term is used more loosely now than it was. Three examples that of writers of autofiction: W.G. Sebald, Knausgaard, Sheila Heti, I guess Ben Lerner would be in that group. It basically, it doesn't just mean autobiographical fiction. It really is I seem to remember, Hari, turn your mic on. I seem to remember you writing about this, about autofiction.
I've written about autofiction. On a couple of occasions, I've been asked to write about Knausgaard and Ben Lerner, and I've kind of tried to unpick, why there was this sort of moment that I think is maybe slightly peaked. Kind of,
I think you're right.
So there was a moment where there was a sort of hostility or kind of rejection of some of the protocols of fiction, and people seem to want to write in a more kind of lyric first person. And I mean, like, Lerner is a poet, and his novels strike me as poets' novels. I mean, an interesting thing about Knausgaard actually was that I couldn't really judge his project until I'd gone back and I'd read the novel that he wrote before he started the big My Struggle autofiction books, and I found out he's actually rather a gifted novelist. He's absolutely no slouch at making things up, and that made the decision to reject that stuff kind of more interesting to me.
Yeah, and I mean, could you, for Charlotte's question, I mean, if you had to give a definition of autofiction, because it's hard. I mean, we both know where it comes from. It comes from France, but because it's been diluted or whatever. And originally in autofiction, the I and the author were the same and had the same name. That was an important part of it. That's not there. Like Rachel Cusk, for example, is really not strictly autofictional either. And she, her character is called Faye, and it's the name is only mentioned once or twice. But Knausgård, on the other hand, I think, at least the volumes of the struggle would be called, and of course he does call himself Carl in that.
Yeah, I mean, somebody sort of said to me the key to the distinction is the French have two types of narrative words for narrative. They have the récit and the roman,
Mm-hmm.
and the roman is much more like the kind of conventional novel, but and a récit is a prose narrative, but is a prose narrative voiced by a voice that is at the very least a kind of construction of the writer, a sort of a version of the writer that's sufficiently close not to be called a character. I mean, I don't think we can ultimately, put a fine, clear line between these kinds of writing, but I mean, it is interesting to me that in France it's become a kind of conventional way of doing narrative, and it has been going on since the late 60s, and at least, and whereas here it was felt to be terribly transgressive a few years ago.
Exactly.
It was as if nobody had been reading in translation at all.
Well, but what's interesting though is that people talk about autofiction all the time and almost never bring up Proust.
Well, right. I mean, I actually I did a class on memoir the other night, and we ended up reading some Rousseau, and then sort of drawing a line from Rousseau to Proust,
Yeah,
and then forward. And there's this kind of there's a there's a tradition that I think you can make reach very far back to the kind of roots of prose narrative in a way.
oh, another really good example of an earlier example for in America of autofiction is I mentioned Elizabeth Hardwick before. Sleepless Nights
Okay, I don't know
is a
that.
wonderful work of autofiction, and when it came out in '76 or whatever it was, nobody called it autofiction.
And
You
it
know,
doesn't bother you, that term? I mean, to be honest, I think of it as a bit of an insult, actually, because I
no,
feel like what it does is it asks an insult, meaning not as a jab necessarily, but that it demands the question, or it presents the question, well, who is the writer? And not what is the writer trying to convey about society through a lived experience. And I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, what is the difference between construction of a narrative and creation of, what you said about Karl Ove Knausgaard's, first novel? Like, what's the difference between creating something imaginative or not real versus morphing something that occurred in real life? Like, hasn't that boundary been fluid forever? Like, I don't know. I mean, maybe with fantasy fiction or sci-fi or something, but even that is like a projection of some kind of, one's imagination comes from the subconscious. I don't know. I wonder about that. Like, are these categories even real, or are they created by commerce to box things here, box things there? And I'm curious.
I don't find the term autofiction as an insulting one, because I think the project of a sort of game with selfhood is quite an interesting one for prose narrative to take on. But I quite like having the two words for a sort of outwardly directed, character driven narrative, and something that's more contemplative, perhaps, or more, or sort of much closer to the selfhood of the writer. But I mean, it is, you know, was taken as a threat here, I think, the kind of arrival of that sort of group of books in the early kind of 2010s, whenever they turned up, because I think it felt, you know, some people felt that in some way it was, you know, it was yet another round of the death of fiction, which kind of, you know, we've been cranking the handle on that one for, you know, since before I was born, certainly. And you know, I mean, it's a kind of, it allowed everybody to have a kind of another sort of canter around the track with, you know, with what is the novel, and can the novel speak to us still, and, you know, all that sort of thing. But I mean, I feel like it did, you know, it certainly marked a kind of generational shift from maybe a sort of fashion for quite maximalist postmodern work. You know, I mean, certainly the sort of Foster Wallacey type of fiction felt very, suddenly, you know, that was not going to be, you know, the mode that people were interested in. And I think we're now moving beyond that. I wouldn't like to say what the kind of the, you know, the bright shiny thing is at the moment, but I feel that certainly in the American context, the autofictional boom is maybe on the wane.
I mean, you certainly, I get this question a lot in nonfiction classes, and we looked at Ocean Byung's, he published a part of On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous in the New Yorker that was published as a personal history, technically in their memoir nonfiction category, and yet that excerpt appears basically verbatim in the novel. You know, so in some ways, it's I think of the Garth Greenwell once told me in an interview, it's more about like where you as an author want to plant your flag. Is it feel more, you know, is it in the camp of this is truth, and therefore the questions that I'm opening the reader up to of this narrator has to do with me, or is it's slightly pushed away a little bit, so I can choose to engage with the truthful aspects of it, or I can also choose to maybe not engage with the truthful aspects of it because I've shifted it a little bit from myself.
I mean, you should point out that Ocean Vuong is another poet as well, who's, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a route which poets find very congenial for entering prose narrative.
Yeah. But well, thank you, Charlotte, for a fantastic question, and thank you to the three authors tonight for giving such in-depth answers to this. It was really, really wonderful to hear you all speak about this and about your work. So yeah, if you guys can just show a little love there for Hari Kunzru and Sigrid Nunes and Makenna Goodman. Thank you guys so much. This has been very cool. I'm going to put this the link up for next time, Thursday, October 22nd. The Antibody will be back with Angela Chen, Athena Dixon, and Melissa Falavino. If autofiction and the question of, you know, construction of narrative and your engagement with the author's engagement with, you know, themselves in that narrative, and is it them or is it fictional? If that moves you, come back and hear from some nonfiction authors who are totally bearing themselves in some ways on the page, and ask them. We'll hear from them. It'll be great. But thank you again to tonight's readers. Thank you for the great audience for being here, and thanks to the Literary Hub. This will be archived on their virtual book channel. So till next time, everybody, stay healthy, stay optimistic, and keep reading books. Thank you all so much.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sigrid. Thank you, Hari. Thank you, Makenna. Thank you, Ryan Matthews.